Well, as we're all reeling with what Russia is doing to the Ukraine, we've got to remember that Russia's influence spans the reaches of Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and South America. And its mistrust of Western authorities, such as NATO and the United States. Who stands to gain? Who will fight for whom? What must the West do now? Well, to answer some of these questions, we're delighted to be joined by a great friend of this show, Qanta Ahmed from the States. Qanta, great to see you. How are you?
Great to see you,
Qanta, we're going to look at this from a slightly...
Sure.
Sorry, carry on, Qanta. Yep. So let's look at this from a different angle now.
Statement. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's look at this from a different angle now, and that is the Middle East angle. You've worked extensively in the Middle East. You've treated patients of wars in the Middle East. And you look at this from a very different perspective in terms of how Russia is viewed in the Middle East. So talk us through your thoughts, particularly about Syria and Iran, and what this means for Israel.
Yeah, that's right. I have practiced medicine in Saudi Arabia. I spent over a decade teaching medicine in the Middle East, and then more recently was visiting the aftermath of many of America's wars in the Middle East and what happens to the people left behind in their wake in Iraq, and particularly in Iraqi Kurdistan. So unfortunately, I've been very familiar with how the United States has been viewed there. And we have progressively, as Americans, left an incredible vacuum behind us wherever these conflicts have ended. So I think one thing is, you've referred to it already, the United States collapsed exit from Afghanistan was a shock to all Western and NATO allies, but it also reminded everybody in the region that alliances with the United States are not long-lasting, may only be as long as an election cycle, and there is a search for more staunch allies. In the same time frame, Russia has been heavily investing in the Middle East. Remember, Russia was and continues to be present in the Syrian civil war. Russia has become extremely battle-hardened in insurgency warfare, fighting alongside Hezbollah, that's Iran's paramilitia, and actually securing Assad's Syria against all of the odds, a place where the United States actually retreated very early on after stating our own red lines were crossed when Assad murdered his own citizens with chemical weapons. So the region is looking at this, and two countries in particular tonight strike me. One is the United Arab Emirates that voted or that abstained to vote in the United Nations Security Council veto against Russia. United Arab Emirates said we need more time for diplomacy, but in fact that's representing a strategic shift. That's a leading Gulf Arab nation that's a major player and part of the Abraham Accords agreement with Israel. And the other country that's nearby, but is also very influential in a nuclear power, is Pakistan. Pakistan, its leader, Imran Khan, was visiting Moscow on the day that Putin rolled into Ukraine. And Pakistan was called by the American president's representatives to suggest that he might not visit Moscow, and ignored that, because Pakistan is looking for more diplomatic engagement. Pakistan needs to secure its energy, and Pakistan wants Russia to build liquid natural gas installations in its Arabian Sea port in Gwadar, which China has already developed. So what this means for Israel is enormously pragmatic. It's a Jewish state that is battle-hardened and is in a difficult neighborhood. For instance, it has resigned itself to being neighbors with Syria, and fortunately has not been sucked into the Syrian civil war conflict, because the Assad Israel knows is better than the devil Israel does not know. And at the same time, American disengagement is going to bind together Abraham Accord nations extremely tightly, perhaps even more than had been envisioned. Israel still can launch operations against Iranian interests when it serves Israeli interests, and Russia allows Israel to do that, while Russia pursues arms deals and trade deals with Iran. And here in President Biden's America, we're getting ready to bring Iran back into the international community when oil is at $105 a barrel. So as we watch the speeches being given by the EU, and as we watch the United States now sending Stinger missiles to Ukraine, this is a disaster of the West's own making. From the inception of the end of the Cold War, commitments were made that NATO would not open up its borders right onto Russian borders. And the West has repeatedly ignored that, and we now have a very provoked Russia in the setting of American disengagement from almost the entire region.
Rita.
And that American disengagement, we saw the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan that you mentioned, but there's also really no appetite from the Americans, and I would suggest many from Europe, to get involved in a ground war, to send their troops, to send their sons to be killed fighting Russia. So what impact does that have on what happens next? Because they know that much of the West does not want to be intimately involved in this conflict. We're happy to place sanctions and send money and send arms, but we don't want to send our sons and to fight.
That's right, and that's an absolute tragedy for Ukrainians, and that is also a chilling, very frightening situation for the Baltic states to realize. And at the same time, something even more shocking is the absolute fracture inside Europe, where Germany has a Nord Stream 2 and Nord Stream 1 pipeline dependent on Russian gas. Most of Europe is dependent on Russian liquefied natural gas to a tremendous degree. And now is being asked to give that up, which will have an enormous impact on German manufacturing. It's about the only big economy in Europe that still manufactures. So these are huge real world problems. And I think what this means, it takes us back to the Syrian civil war again. Just like the Spanish Civil War, all the world powers that were drawn into the Spanish Civil War, 10 years later, were facing direct conflict with those superpowers. And we're about 10 years out of the Syrian civil war, looking at the United States and Russia facing each other over the proxy of Ukraine. And Ukraine may be completely scapegoated and abandoned. Another nation to be very keen to look at, which could be a game changer, is Turkey. Turkey, which today apparently is announcing that they will not allow Russia access, Black Sea access. Turkey is one of the world's leading suppliers of armed drones. And Turkey was engaged in supporting the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia and gave Azerbaijan the advantage with drone warfare. So we can now see that Turkey is supporting Ukraine, and Turkey may decide to share its drone technology with Ukraine, which can really take off balance a superpower and even deter major airspace overreach that Russia has just with drone technology. This whole situation is getting so far out of hand. Ordinary Americans have spoken to me that have served in Vietnam, that have served in the Cuban Missile area, that have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they are feeling heartbroken at the absolute abandonment of the Ukrainian people by the world superpowers, including the United States.
Qanta, I've just come back from the United States myself. Americans are incredibly concerned about energy prices. Oil is now $105 a barrel. You say that they're heartbroken about what's happening in Ukraine, but how much political appetite is there going to be for more inflationary pain as the United States gets involved with this issue in Ukraine?
So I'm so glad you've mentioned that, James. I again filled the car up for gas yesterday. Half a tank of gas is almost $60. It's unbelievable. And so there is not only no appetite for inflation, there is also no appetite for supporting what we are finding an extremely enfeebled American administration. We cannot handle our southern border. The pandemic has pitted American against American, depending on where they feel about the mask, about the vaccination. Suddenly, of course, the pandemic has vanished from our television screens tonight because of this conflict. And so we have never been a more preoccupied, more divided nation, which has been consumed with woke neo-orthodoxy, critical race theory, and demonizing America's Jews. So I don't know how we will unite this country for any kind of motive. But at the same time, there's been no compassion for the rising prices of energy in the American citizens by the Americans' own government. The very first thing President Biden did is kill the Keystone Pipeline that brings energy from Canada to the United States. So I don't know the answer to your question, but it's not looking very favorable.
Qanta Ahmed, always so great to chat to you. I wanted also to chat to you briefly about anti-Semitism. You are a council member of the Committee to Combat Contemporary Anti-Semitism in the USC Shoah Foundation. Just very briefly before we go, and thank you for your amazing insights into everything that's happening there in Ukraine and the Middle East. Just tell us, you touched on this idea of the demonizing of Jews as part of the whole kind of woke agenda. Just briefly, just give us 30 seconds on your work on that, and we'll come back to it another time as well.
So we're seeing that progressive politics is becoming mainlined into the United States. That means universities are embracing progressive politics that focus on identity politics and divide people between oppressors and the oppressed. And in the oppressors, they put anyone that is white, and they consider Jews as a white oppressor. So Jewish students are disadvantaged, demonized, isolated on university campuses. We have progressive DAs that are not prosecuting criminals. So hate crimes against Jewish people, anti-Semitic hate crimes are not being prosecuted or punished to the same degree. We have big tech and social media carrying digital anti-Semitism without any respite, so that there is an overwhelming flood of anti-Semitic language, ideas, mythologies that is now widespread. And we have big industries that are willing to participate in movements that are fueled by foreign terrorist organizations, boycott, divestment, sanction groups, so that buying an ice cream or buying some other item is based on the precedent of Israel being a white colonialist settler apartheid state. This has become so mainstream in a country where people are no longer attached to history. We're in a postmodern era where truth is now debatable, where identity trumps everything unless you're Jewish. It's an extremely dangerous time.
Dr. Qanta Ahmed, it's always so great to chat to you. We'll speak to you in a few weeks' time here on Outsiders.